So across the various sessions yesterday, I think there was a lot of discussions about the various kinds of outcomes that are being operationalized at a city level, whether we are talking about Swachh Bharat or we're talking about the smart city projects now, or whether it's a question of how do you develop a city into a growth engine, an economic growth engine, or even the fact that how do you come up with a plan to mitigate the kind of vulnerability that the most marginalized populations in the city might be facing, whether that's through a city sanitation plan or whether that's through a housing plan, the kind that we talked about yesterday. So there are a lot of different kinds of outcomes, and there are a lot of different kinds of multiple interventions that are being made. So what I would like to suggest is that if we start thinking about some of the ways that we can cut through and look at the various interventions that's happening, just to get some sort of a framing in. So the first way to think about it is probably a systemic way. So some of the kinds of networks that are being, where there's a physical network involved. Like for example, in a transportation plan for a city, you would have a physical network that would be there that covers all the different parts of a city. You'll have to have some kind of a decision about what kind of a mix there might be between a public transportation and private transportation, what the pricing mechanisms would be to sort of actually address the affordability levels of the various socioeconomic groups, that the way they are distributed across the city, et cetera. So you're taking a systemic view into that. Same thing, sort of a water and sanitation also, a same thing can be taken. But similarly, you can also take a very systemic view into something like housing. So, Gautam yesterday presented a schematic of that. So taking a city's population, dividing into various socioeconomic groups, seeing a need assessment, but sort of a qualitative gap and need assessment of that, seeing where they are, what kinds of interventions can be made, whether that's a public intervention, whether there's a private intervention, what kind of contracts can come together depending on where the public agency is leading or the private agency is leading. So there is a possibility of seeing that if there is an issue happening within, say, the housing sector, taking a systemic approach. Similarly for an urban economy, a very similar kind of a thing, socioeconomic groups, where are they working? Do they need a credit access? Do they need land access? So a systemic approach for that. Sectors is a more simpler, more familiar sort of a format. Various sectors, finance moves through that, various kinds of permissions and the operationalization in terms of approvals, etc., might flow through this. Scales, this obviously, I mean, as per like in a lot of the discussions yesterday, it gets a little bit more complicated because, of course, some issues need to probably are better addressed at certain scales. Like if it's a community-led sanitation plan, a ward level might work better. If you're talking about a city which needs to be developed as an economic growth engine in a particular sector, a regional view might work better. But then again, like many of you pointed out yesterday, that there would be time lags associated with approval processes because there is a scalar question here. So anyway, so there is a little bit of sort of dissonance that builds in with the scale. So what I would suggest as a way is that because all of these things are happening through some of these different approaches, there's a sectoral planning thing happening, there's a spatial planning thing happening, there's a services planning thing happening, and most of them having very distinct processes. What I would suggest is that bringing some of these together into an integrated frame might help in getting over some of the systemic barriers that are there. And as an example, what I will do very quickly is take the example of spatial planning and give you a little bit of a history as to how that's developed in India right now, and therefore some of the systemic barriers that have come in within the spatial planning framework. And sort of taking that forward, then if there is a more integrated format, what kind of barriers can we sort of then address or get beyond? So this is a very brief chronology, it's not detailed at all, but the spatial imagination has been very strong right from the very beginning in terms of planning interventions in the country. So starting from sort of the colonial interventions in the sanitation committees that were set up, the distinctions that were there between the native town and the white town, the spatial imagination is very strong. That gets amplified quite a bit post-independence with a lot of these greenfield new capital cities that are being set up, or in terms of the new industrial townships that are set up, very clearly operationalizing that modern urban India, what that vision actually means. And I think this quote from Nehru is very sort of telling. He said this about Chandigarh: let this be a new town, symbolic of freedom, expressions of the nation's faith, and unfettered by the past. So it's also sort of jumping ahead on that curve. And I think in a lot of the imaginations now also around that kind of greenfield, this thing, maybe a similar sort of an echo can be heard, a similar sort of feeling. But the greenfield imagination was also a very rational sort of a framework. It's a very spatial, rational framework, different zones, very clear gridiron pattern, different kinds of uses that's happening in various things. The gridiron pattern also being overlaid with how the transportation is being laid on, how the services network is being laid on. And some of those kind of thinking also then translates into, like in the second five-year plan with the town planning legislations, when master planning becomes sort of the critical and sort of central spatial planning tool. And a lot of those greenfield imaginations, different zones, different kinds of development control norms, comes through that sort of historical legacy as well, which is again, I mean, as you're all very familiar with, it has sort of a UK garden city, an American town planning, sort of a longer legacy written into it as well, then sort of applied into the Indian context. So I'm not going to go into all the various problems that are there with the spatial planning, especially the master planning listening, because you're all very, very familiar with it. But I just want to highlight 3 points. One, it's a whole spatial planning unit which doesn't have necessarily an economic planning built into it. Second, it doesn't have land market assessments built into the planning framework itself. Yet, the entire thing, because it is so spatially oriented, is all about land allocation. So there is a dissonance right there. And the third, that there isn't necessarily a framework that allows for how the financing is going to happen of that spatial vision. How do you translate that? So land becomes both the main source of financing that plan, but then it also overlays with all of the landowners that are there in the city already and their aspirations of how do you capture value from that land. So I mean, this is a familiar story. This is a very long written story as to why master plans have not been able to keep up with the kind of growth divergences that have happened inside particular cities. And at the very heart of it is this sort of dissonance between the fact that spatial planning and a financial or a sectoral planning have been separated. There's sort of a silo vision over here. So this is a very quick sort of an overview into the various spatial planning instruments that are there. And this again highlights that all of the various things that we were talking about before, that there is a scalar issue here. The various plans that are being prepared, they are being done by different authorities with different levels of sectoral jurisdictions. Some of them, like for example, the municipal authority is not just preparing spatial-based plans, they're also preparing sectoral plans. So there is, even within an institution, there might be various things that are being, there's a nesting, there are various timelines that are associated. Anyway, these are all you're familiar with, so I will go very quickly. Simultaneously, with the spatial planning instrument, there is also all of the sector and scheme plans that are coming up. Now, each one of this also has a land allocation issue. However, they are often sort of in the separate silo from the spatial plan. The spatial planning thing is happening simultaneously and parallelly along with all of this. So what I would suggest is, because there is, I mean, you're familiar with it, that there is a dissonance between this fact of having these two particular different silos, that how do you bring together these different disparate frames in a way to get over some of these systemic barriers that are there.